I'm going to kind of casually start. How does that sound? Thank you all for coming to day 2. And I thought a lot about how to begin this day. And I think what I'd like to do is give a couple reasons for why I ordered it, first of all, in the way that I did. And then second of all, I'd like to go back to the theme for some of the folks that weren't here yesterday, but in a different way than yesterday. So the reason that I presented the Beethoven Opus 120 first, and I actually recorded it first a year ago, because I knew I couldn't record 3 CDs in one semester. But the reason that I chose the Beethoven to go first is because it was published first. So in the historical events that led up to the Diabelli 50 plus and the Beethoven Opus 120, which I played last night, is that Beethoven completed his 33 variations first, and Diabelli published that set as part 1 in 1823. And then in 1824, when the 50th was completed, he published the set that I'm speaking about today. And so I kind of just went in order of how it came about, basically. And so without further ado, I just would like to play the theme. I won't play repeats because I have a lot of things to talk about. And then I'll just say a few words about that. So, located in that music, those 32 bars, as I said yesterday, there are a lot of potentialities in that music. I broke down some of the motives, and I'll just say a few. There's a grace note, there's a turn figure, there's a half step. That's in the first 3 notes alone. There's a pickup, because this is a waltz, and it's in 3/4 time. So we're starting on beat 3. So that's important. There's a descending fourth in what becomes the accompanimental voice, and then in what becomes the kind of melody. Oh, sorry. There's a turn figure, and then there's these just hideously obnoxious repeated chords. And then in the 3rd and 4th phrases in both parts, that's called a sequence, where you have an idea, you play it up or down, however far of a distance you choose, and then you play it up or down, however far of a distance you choose. And the story goes that theme was kind of ridiculed by Beethoven, but Maynard Solomon really takes that whole story apart from the Schindler account of it, and it's not actually true. But if you learn about this piece in musical history, that is something that you learn, that Beethoven said, oh, this is not valuable, but then he goes and writes the 33 that we heard last night. So, as a way to kind of segue into this, I just wanted to say that hearing the Opus 120 in person is, I hope anyway, a really powerful and visceral experience. What Beethoven gleaned or pulled from those 32 bars, I mean, what I hear in it, I can hear the comic, I can hear even boring. I can hear, the potentials. It's in C major, and I said yesterday, it's kind of like a playground for a composer's imagination. C major has no flats or sharps in its key signature. So, and there's a whole register issue. There's the idea that it's a dance. I mean, all of these things play into the imagination of a composer. And last night, in the 33 by Beethoven, he pulls out the reverent. He pulls out the comic. He finds tragic. He finds spiritual. He finds joy. He finds excitement. He finds, I can't even think of enough adjectives or expressive words to talk about everything that's in those 33. And he methodically created this narrative, as I said, that sort of interposes the juxtaposition of these things in a way that you eventually have this trajectory to this sort of spiritually sublime place at the end. And so if we turn now to the Diabelli set, Diabelli lived from 1781 to 1858. So this is his 240th year. Not that that's a big anniversary, but it's the 240th year of his birth. And he's really known in music history for three things. He wrote, if you've ever studied or taught piano, you may have played a little baby teaching piece by Anton Diabelli. So he's known as what's called a pedagogical composer. He also is known as Schubert's first publisher, and he's also known for this set. Some people might say that he's kind of obscure. He's truly not obscure, but he was a genius in the materials that he gave to the composers in this waltz. So in 1819, as the story goes, he put a notice in the Vienna newspaper. And you have to understand, in 1819, we're coming off the heels of the Congress of Vienna historically, where the whole world, the whole European world was coming to that capital to figure things out, as it were. And so Vienna took a lot of pride in hosting this, and Diabelli was part of that. So he's latching on to that patriotic, nationalistic thought process that's probably still in the minds and the hearts of the Viennese at that point. It's no mistake that he picked a waltz, which is kind of the symbol of Vienna, still is the symbol of Vienna, to represent that. He titled it. I'm not good at the pronunciation in German, so I'll just translate, the Patriotic Artists Association. So this was clearly in his thought process. And so you also should know that historically, there was one set that was published prior to this, but almost as a competing situation by another publishing firm. There had never been a project like this. There had never been, here's a theme for the keyboard, here's X amount of people to write a variation on that theme. So this is a first in history, and it actually spiraled some sequels from other folks later on in musical history. So what's the point? So he had just gotten his job really at the Cappy publishing firm in around 1819, and so this is a chance for him to make his mark, right? So he's a business person. So it makes sense that he wanted to do something to put himself on the map, so to speak. But what I admire about him is he claims, and I think rightly so, that he got the 50 most famous virtuosi and composers and musicians living and working or from Vienna, and he probably did. That's not really disputed. But what's interesting is that as history has gone on, of course, many of these people we aren't familiar with today. So he gathered these 50 folks, and it took about 5 years, and finally he had his document, so to speak. For me, this makes a really amazing, like, anthropological, sociological sort of record of musicians that wrote for the keyboard. And my life, I can say, well, hey, I'd like to track down more music by so and so. So it's made me aware of other possibilities by these individuals. But to go along with what I was saying yesterday, this whole idea of a variation set and the concept of the simultaneity between unity and diversity. So every variation is only in existence because it's got a theme to come from. Its genesis is that theme. And yet, at the same time, it's not a great variation set if the variations don't sound incredibly different. And that's this really compelling aspect for me with this particular structure, that these two seemingly disparate phenomenon can coexist. And they coexist in fascinating ways. Sometimes in the Beethoven, they're paired specifically together to repel one another, almost, like a civil discourse. And sometimes they're the ones that are close to each other are meant to make a progression expressively somehow. The difference that we have, of course, with this Diabelli set is that now we have an added layer of diversity. So Beethoven shows us that diversity can be achieved through a single human being's compositional imagination. And that's an incredible experience. This set adds another layer to my concept, I guess, if you want to talk about diversity, because we now have a group of people working together on something common. So not only do we have a structure, but we have that mirrored in the actual participatory level. Diversity in 1824 is a lot different than the concept of diversity today. But what we do have are 50 individuals. Now, I've also said 53 because a couple folks submitted 2 variations. And then Carl Cherney was asked not only to write a variation, but to write a summing up kind of coda to the set. And it's just a stream of variations itself. So I kind of throw the coda in there as a 53rd variation just because that's how it kind of works. So, but I need to kind of move on, but that's sort of my tenet, that's kind of my thesis for this whole project. And the one thing I'd like to just come back to very quickly, I know I've said it, but Maynard Solomon made this point about how this waltz is kind of the commonplace. At one point, Beethoven, in his first writings about this waltz, he called it a Deutscher Tanz, which is a German dance. He didn't call it a waltz right away. And the subtle differentiations there are that this is a music for the universe, the universality kind of idea. And so again, you have this complex intersection between what is a high style dance and this commonality issue that's happening. And again, this has just been really a fascinating project for me to kind of work through. The other part of Diabelli's little business undertaking here is that he actually donated the proceeds to the widows and orphans of the Napoleonic Wars. So whatever you can say about him trying to get publicity for himself and trying to make a name for himself, he must have had a good heart. And I admire that about him, trying to put something good back into the world, so to speak. And so with all of that, I'm just going to tear in. I had thought that having yesterday a little over an hour to talk about the Beethoven, I'm going to have plenty of time to say everything I would love to say and tear apart each variation, and I literally have no time to say anything close to what I'd like to say, maybe someday. But I think what I'd like to do is just leave you with this and then dig in, and that is that after hearing the Beethoven, after playing the Beethoven, it's kind of inconceivable to think that anybody could possibly do anything else with those 32 bars, right? I mean, how much is there left to do? As it turns out, there's 53 other ways for now, and so here we go. Oh, one more thing, sorry. Diabelli organized this alphabetically by last name. And in an article, an Australian professor who dealt with this piece in 2011, he says, so there's no overarching narrative because, of course, it's just randomly alphabetical. Well, in choosing to organize this alphabetically, Diabelli, of course, casts a certain narrative onto it, right, onto the piece. Other narratives are possible, but you do hear the fact that by nature of their last name, this is where they sit in this particular set. So now, without further ado. So you've heard the theme. So Ignaz Osmeyer, he was a liturgical composer, and I think it'll be fairly easy for you to hear some of the thematic aspects. I don't have much time, so you'll hear more tonight. Moving on quickly, so you hear these running 16th notes, and you hear the pickup rhythm, obviously, and some other things. Ignaz Osmeyer, just interestingly, was a friend of Schubert, so there are associations here. Carl Maria von Bocklet also was a friend of Schubert, and Schubert dedicated his D major sonata to him. And I hear a little bit of something we heard in Beethoven last night. So Beethoven had an octave jumping trill thing happening in Variation 21 last night. Moving on, because I have 53, so I'm sorry. Moving on, Leopold Čapek chooses to write in 3/8 meter, which gives it a little lighter character. And again, he uses the upbeat and a lot of registral space. So on and so forth. So you can hear the sequence, you can hear the pickup, you can hear the little turn figure. So the theme is very much alive in these pieces. And yet, Beethoven didn't write any of these. So they're all diverse, but they're also very close to the theme in many ways. The next one is Karl Cherney. So he got to write a variation and a coda. And Karl Cherney is one of the famous people in this set because he studied with Beethoven and he taught Liszt. So he's a good linchpin in the whole musical history situation. He also wrote like 800 studies for the piano that most of us don't like to play. But here's his waltz. Very cute. He stays pretty close to the theme because you're going to hear his coda later on, which is very cool. Joseph Cherney, no relation. His is a lyrical, I would call it a more lyrical version of the theme. So, singing just a little more delicate. Moritz Graf von Dietrichstein is a little bit like Beethoven's Variation 8, kind of. The right hand is almost exactly like Diabelli's original theme, and then you get these very tumultuous left hand running notes going underneath. Now, you might think, okay, are these just all going to be 32 bars and, wow. But no, Joseph Drexler's is marked quasi-overture, so it's a slow introduction and then a faster allegro. And it's virtuosic and it's very orchestrally conceived. So here's a little bit of the overture, the adagio. Okay, so there's a little bit of that, and then to let you hear some of the allegro. So fun, happy, you know, but very thick textures towards the end. Emanuel Forester, variation number 8, is a 300-bar fugue. So some of these composers didn't take this lightly. In fact, I would argue that none of them do. Other people say, oh, this was just a toss-off composition for so-and-so. I actually will disagree with that. But here's a little bit of Forester's. This was his last composition. He died before it got published. So here's a little bit. Now, I know we're only at number 8, but so far we have not heard anything that Beethoven wrote. And you know, that's what's so captivating for me anyway, is all of the possibilities musically that people could pull from the same music. I mean, their imaginations go to these very diverse places, and it's just astounding how many ways you can play around with 32 bars in C major. Speaking of which, Jacob Freistaedtler, so far, by the way, we've all been in C major, but he has a new meter, 9/8. So totally new, a little deeper, maybe expressively. Johann Gainsbacher stays pretty close to the theme, but it's kind of virtuosic in how he handles registral space in this one. So. So on and so forth. Abe Gelinek focuses on the repeated note motive. These changes are not quite as much as what Beethoven does in his Variation 10, but there's maybe a few textural similarities to this one. Sorry to be running through this, but I have other things to say as we get towards the end as well. Anton Halm returns to the 3/4 meter, and this is a triplet motive, and it's, I guess I would say, kind of subdued or peaceful for this one in some ways. So. It's just a beautiful little tune, marked dolce, okay? And next we come to Joachim Hoffman, and this one compresses Diabelli's opening phrase to eliminate the repeated notes. Now, lots of things have been done to Diabelli's music in these, but to take away the repeated notes takes away one of the biggest essences of that theme. So this is kind of an interesting one in that regard. So, and you also get, as I alluded to yesterday, we are not going to get away from counterpoint. We've already had a fugue. Lots of composers will resort to that particular compositional technique throughout, some more than others, obviously. Johann Horzalka is marked, his variation is marked adagio, and it's really an aria, for lack of a better generic term for this. It's got kind of an introduction. It's also, by the way, in the key of A flat major, which is the first time we've left home. Now, remember, we've left home in terms of keys by nature of alphabetizing, not by, Genesis plan, as the case may be. But we're in the key of A flat major, and so after several bars of this kind of introductory idea, we fall into this kind of music. That's very beautiful. I mean, singing is cantabile, and how the heck do you get that from that waltz? You know, it's just astounding how far away it is, and yet, if I had all the time in the world, I could trace many, many, many motives back to the theme for you. As luck would have it, Joseph Hugelmann's variation is also in A flat major. So 14 and 15 are in the same distant key, which is interesting, I guess, as just something to point out. So on and so forth. Now, the next name on the list is someone that a lot of you might know, and that's Johan Neo Hummel. He's a famous guy. We've got him for a few pieces, right? And he was a child prodigy. He wrote a treatise. We know that he wrote a lot of music that we still perform today, obviously. So this is a famous figure from this set. And he writes, certain authors say, well, he just kind of tossed this off and didn't put much into it. But I actually would disagree. He just writes a beautiful, peaceful kind of variation on the theme. So see what you think. It's got a lot of repose. It has some internal inner voice counterpoint. So I give it more credit than some people have musically. Anselm Hüttenbrenner has an octave rendition of the turn. So that little idea comes from the turn. So. So on and so forth. So a little more virtuosic, a little more energetic in character. The Frederick Cultbrenner, this is another famous one. He wrote a lot of virtuoso piano music. He got in a lot of, I think, playing duels, if I remember right. He was part of this kind of rise of virtuosic piano playing schools that started to pop up around this time. He was really active in Paris. And one of the things I wanted to tell you is here's the opening of Beethoven's 9th variation from last night. Okay, and here's the opening of Kalkbrenner's. Quite similar, to begin. Even somewhat similar in character. I think this one's a little more jubilant, even though it's written in the key of A minor than Beethoven's number 9. But it's interesting that the same texture came to both of them in terms of their process. Number 19, Frederick Cultbrenner, has huge registral space and octaves that really make this one kind of spanning the whole keyboard, to be honest. So here's a little bit of this. So within the variation, he changes character, kind of like we've heard Beethoven do last night. But also, you know, again, this idea of registral expanse is a huge factor in the textures that these composers are working with. Because honestly, if you stay in one part of the piano, you're very limited to what all you can possibly do there. So register is a big factor in how you create diversity and variation. Joseph Krukowski's variation number 20, interestingly, like Beethoven's number 20, kind of gives a moment of repose expressively, which is helpful for the performer. So it's just lovely. I love to play that one. Variation 21 is by Conradine Kreutzer. This is all made of triplets. You're going to hear lots of triplets. This must have been the rhythm of the day back in the 1820s. So lots of triplets. None of them are the same, but here's his version. So, kind of an etude in terms of its texture. Edward Baron Lanois, his is technically difficult but very sparse in texture, which makes it scary to play. But it's got kind of this converse texture where one voice is coming down and the other voice is coming up, and ne'er the twain shall meet. So. So it's a jumpy one. It's going to scare me a little bit. M.J. Maximilian Leidesdorf has the theme in the left hand in octaves. And again, here's our favorite rhythm du jour, the triplets. So. But not the same, right? So how many ways can you use triplets? We're going to find out. Now, the next one is the one variation that if you take a piano lit course, maybe even a music history class, you learn that Franz Liszt wrote a variation for this set. Franz Liszt was 11 when he wrote this variation. Most likely, he got asked to do this because he was studying with Carl Cherney. So Carl Cherney's the bigwig, and he says, "Hey, I've got this cool kid. You should have him write a piece." There's no way I could have written this at age 11. So this is the first time that we're in the key of C minor, and it's only one of 2 times that we're in the key of C minor in the whole set, which is kind of amazing. So. So that's an 11-year-old. So if that doesn't predetermine what a virtuosic, incredible pianist and composer he's going to become, you know, it's just kind of an amazing snapshot at Here he is before he became a star. So historically, it's really important. What follows is just really a glorious Viennese waltz by Joseph Meiseter. And it's just so delicate and so fun. So just completely different world. You know, you wish you could say, oh, Diabelli absolutely put this to follow that tempestuous, tragic Liszt variation, but he didn't. But even though that wasn't the case, it's still how they're ordered. So we get to expressively kind of enjoy that diverse kind of conflict that's happening between certain variations. Ignaz Moscheles is kind of famous in the piano teaching world. He was a champion of Beethoven's music. He wrote a method for piano. So this is someone whose name pops up from now and again. So a very simple texture, but it's beautiful, and it has value. You know, it has meaning, it has potential. Ignaz Moscheles writes a variation completely based on really difficult arpeggios. So here's a little bit of his. So he's just all over the piano again in kind of this ethereal, cascading sort of expressive area. The next character is someone we kind of know. So this is Mozart Jr., as I like to call him. So this is Mozart's surviving son, Franz Xavier Wolfgang Mozart. And he was born the year that Mozart died. And he is one of the two people that submitted two versions of variations to this set. So his first one is a running 16th note figuration. It's wild. He could write like his dad, right? He had chops. He also, by the way, you know, if you saw the movie Amadeus, there's this big fight between Mozart Sr. and Salieri, but Mozart Jr. studied with Salieri. And by the way, Salieri did not contribute to this set because he was quite elderly at the time, and so he wasn't writing anymore. The second variation that Mozart Jr. contributed is a little more comic in nature, a little more lighthearted. So, very different expressive world than the first one. Variation 29 is by Joseph Pani. It's in 6/8 meter, so a different meter, and it's in A minor. Again, just if we just take a pause here, just the wealth of variety that we've heard, just the fantastic structures, sounds, textures, expressive ideas is so captivating as far as how these 50 people did not come up with the same thing, ever, you know, is just mind-boggling to me. So Hieronymus Pyre has back to C major and our favorite rhythm, the triplet. So it's lovely, it's lyrical, not the same as our other triplet variations. Johann Peter Pixis, his number 31, is not super different from Mozart Jr. in a way, in its character. It's laughing, it's happy, and it's very fun to play. So on and so forth. Just happy. It's just fun. It's happy. If we move on, because we have to, we have more triplets from Wenzel Plachy, and this one has a climbing bass line register. The differences here, you know, when do they change register? Which part of the sequence is the composer going to switch register? What are they going to do in that sequence phrase where you have the juxtapositions of the fortes and the piano, you know? And this is all, you know, as I said with kind of my humorous little anecdote yesterday, it's kind of like how I feel if I go to an all-you-can-eat Brazilian steakhouse, right? There's infinite possibilities. I just don't always see them in terms of music like a composer does, and this is a really fun experience to kind of catalog that. Gottfried Rieger, number 33, is the second person to submit 2 variations. So his first one is a 16th note kind of arpeggiation idea. It's really fun. It's a lot of scalar patterns. His second one is more of a Landler, I would say. So it sounds like this. So very different in character. Now the story goes, by the way, with the Mozart and the Rieger, that Diabelli did not publish their second submissions initially. But when it was released again a few years later, they appeared in the set. And I should also say, I'll take a pause for a moment to say that when I was working on my dissertation, my last chapter does kind of a cursory look at this particular work. And at the time, this was 2006, so scores were not readily available. And as it turned out, there are 4 manuscript copies of this available in the world. One of them is at the Library of Congress, and so that's where I got it. Now you can go to IMSLP and get it quite easily, but back in 2006, I had to write the Library of Congress and pay them to get a copy of the manuscript. P.J. Riati, Philip Jakob Riati, was an opera composer, and I think you'll be able to hear that. He also wrote a piano concerto, which he is quite a good composer, so maybe someday I'll check it out. Huge range, Lots of virtuosic passages. It's in 3/4, but the thing to really talk about is that it's in F minor. The second half, he moves to F major. So we've had A flat at times, we've had C minor, we've had A minor, and now we have F minor. As luck would have it, Franz Weber, whose variation follows this one, is in 6/8 meter, and it's in the key of A flat, which is the relative major of F minor. Again, that didn't happen by design, but it happened in terms of a different kind of design, which is the alphabetical. So here's a little bit of Franz Weber's. So on and so forth. It's very lighthearted, very happy. Johann Schenk wrote quite a long variation. It's called the Caprice. It's got a little bit of everything in it in terms of how it handles the theme, but just to give you a small taste. And later on we get some triplets. So he just has this fantastic rhythmic variety, and he moves from one kind of thematic motive to another throughout the piece. Franz Schober-Lechner, this is, I think this is a very comic or happy, joyous variation. So he uses the whole keyboard. You've got these kind of the grace notes. He's obviously playing around with that idea, and it's just a really fun, lighthearted variation. Number 38 is another kind of important milestone in this piece, because we all know Franz Schubert. And so in 1824, Schubert is going to pass away 4 years later. He's famous for writing waltzes, and he is the other composer that chose C minor. So the two most famous people from this set chose this tragic minor key to write their variation in, the 11-year-old Liszt and Schubert. This one is very somber. So it's quite transcendental, really. It's not an upbeat waltz at all. The next variation by Simon Sechter is a canon. So again, this counterpoint idea is coming through. It's quite lovely, it's lyrical. The next character is labeled SRD in the score. Can't remember what I put in the program, but SRD. It stands for Serenissmus Rudolphus Dux. And that is our buddy Archduke Rudolph from Beethoven's life. So he was a student of Beethoven, and he was also his patron. And so Beethoven, of course, generated several works dedicated to him. And so this is Archduke Rudolph, who wrote quite a fascinating fugue. It gets intense, very dense in terms of texture. He was clearly a good keyboard player. Now, why is he in this set? He wasn't a professional musician. Well, obviously, there were some political things that Diabelli probably had to take care of, right? So he's here, and it's kind of nice to have a record of him historically in terms of what he could do. So, Abe Stoddler has another kind of fun, lighthearted take on this, and he plays around with the grace note idea. So, lighthearted, sticks by the theme pretty closely. The next one is Joseph von Saleh. And again, we have the triplet motive, but not the same as the previous ones. So on and so forth. The next one is somebody who varied the genre of the dance quite a lot, because Wenzel Tomaszek wrote a polonaise. So a completely new form that we haven't heard before in this piece. And this one's kind of fun. So he takes the idea of the repeated note, obviously, quite seriously. And he creates kind of this fun-hearted variation. Michael Umlauf has a variation that's marked presto. It's very thin textured, a little bit imitative. So on and so forth, stays up in the high register for the most part. The next one, variation 45, Friedrich Dionysius Weber, has just everything in it, technically. So. So he's a workout a little bit for me. Actually, I'm going to use a golf metaphor. If you know anything about the Masters tournament down in Augusta, they call holes 11 through 13, I think it is, Amen Corner, because you just want to get out of there without getting into trouble. And that's kind of the last 5 or 6 variations for me. It's my Amen Corner. So Franz Weber, not related, writes another kind of technically difficult one, and it's marked brillante, so. So that one's fun. Then we have Karl von Winkler has a new take on the triplets because he juxtaposes dotted eighth notes with the triplets. So you get kind of this jolty feel to it. So, a new take on an old idea. Franz Weiss uses triplets, but juxtaposed against regular eighth notes, but just very thick in terms of the texture that's happening inside of those triplets. So. and so forth. Very noodly, technically, for the pianist. Johann Wittesek has, he kind of uses this French overture idea, sort of a noble dotted figure. Very different end phrase to the first half of that binary form. Finally, we've reached variation 50. Johann Dvořáček has a variation that's kind of straight eighth notes, a little bit rambunctious, lots of registral shifts, and it segues immediately into the coda. I don't know if Cherney originally planned that, if Diabelli originally planned that or not, but it literally moves immediately into the coda on a very unstable chord, actually. Now the end gives you this, and if you go to the coda, there's our link. It's a big shock, and so Carl Cherney's coda is 200 bars. It's nothing short of kind of a virtuosic summing up of a lot of the things that we've heard from some of the various variations, but it's also kind of like a circus, because he just winds it up and winds it up and winds it up and ends with fireworks, basically, for the finale. It's well crafted. It's not a farce by any stretch. It's very well crafted, but it's musically just a smorgasbord, literally, of lots of what we've heard. So it's a really appropriate coda, I would say. So I know this is a very fast little map through this piece, but the reason that I wanted to kind of talk about each one is because it goes back to the whole idea of my work with this project, and that is this whole, unity and diversity concept. And this is musically very different than the experience that you have hearing Beethoven Opus 120. It's aesthetically about as far away as you could get, not because the music is not sound, but because the whole construction of it is so amazingly different than a single composer trying to tackle a normal set of theme and variations. And there's just a huge expressive expanse that you get in all 53, for lack of a better term, that you hear as you listen to it beginning to end. And the characters that are in here are mostly folks that I don't know. And I'm looking forward to maybe trying to see if there are other existing pieces by them for keyboard, because I don't believe that any of this is not well-founded and well-constructed musically. Quite the opposite, actually. And again, though, just the idea of a community participating in a single, colliding event to create something more magnificent than an individual part has truly been a great honor for me to finally take the time to learn this set up against the piece that I've known and loved since 2005. And but I was thinking this morning, I went on a short run, and I I guess maybe I would say I will leave you with this message at the end of this talk, and that is that there's a news broadcast, and this is not trying to be politically oriented in any way, but there's a news broadcast on Friday evenings that pays respect to lives well lived. And I think it's on CNN. And it takes individuals that have passed away from COVID, and it highlights them, it frames them. They are not people that are famous, they are people, everyday people. And I was thinking about that today because to me, all of these composers were lives well lived. They were all trying to make their mark as musicians, most of them. Most of them were, weren't like Beethoven. They didn't achieve, musical universality, musical historical canonizing, so to speak. But at their time, they were doing what they needed to do to get by, and each of these variations is their voice into the world in this greater project. And the project is greater because of the sum of its diverse parts, I think. And so it was just kind of a little compelling sort of way to kind of immerse yourself when and if you hear it live. It's not played hardly ever, this set. I'm sure it's never been done here. It's tricky. It takes a lot of endurance and preparation, but it's just a neat concept for me that came over me, and to think about everyone has value, everyone has something to say, everyone has a life that matters to someone, and so this is Diabelli's kind of paying homage to lives well lived, and I hope that that's a kind of a transcendent message to kind of go away with, and to come at this music if you come back to the performance tonight. So without further ado, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.